I want to talk about minimal compliance, or as a great book, Games Criminals Plays, calls it, Downing a Duck. My name is Anthony Gangi. I'm the host of Tier Talk. Guys, don't forget, follow us on multiple venues: iHeartRadio, TuneIn, YouTube, Spreaker.com, Player FM, Stitcher Radio. List is growing. Again, I mentioned YouTube channel. Let's get that traffic over to the YouTube channel. Let's make that a venue for us. And also like my page on Facebook. Follow us on my app. I have an app. And also I'll be on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network channel. That'll be starting sometime in September. It's available to all 5 boroughs on Vios, and also it streams live from their website. And they also have a Facebook page too. So that'll be a new venture for us, new venture. Okay, so I want to talk about minimal compliance. I call it minimal compliance, but you guys are going to know it as downing a duck. And I want to give my first piece of advice when it comes to manipulation. Two pieces, really. Don't let an inmate take you out of your prescribed role. You're an officer, you're an officer. You know, you're a social worker, you're a social worker. Don't lose your sense of what you're there for, what your role is. And the other thing is, go to staff when you need support. The key to manipulation for an inmate is to isolate you from other staff members. They don't want you to go to them when you're stuck in situations that may be ambiguous. So you need to show them that that's your route, that you are going to go to staff. And it kind of minimizes the target that's on your back. And for any supervisor, I'm sure there's some out there that are lazy and tell a new officer, hey, if you have any questions, you can ask such and such inmate. They've been on the unit for a while. Stupid move. First off, it's insulting. You're telling the officer to go to other inmates. That's insulting when there's support staff that's there. And also, do more tours. You know, let them make yourself visible, and let the inmates see that you're connected to your staff. It helps them. Trust me. The more that you show up in those areas that may be isolated areas, you know, sometimes they got staff that work in isolated areas of the facility. Well, the more you show up, the more it will minimize the target that the inmates put on the officer's back or the staff member's back. Okay, so downing a duck, it's a method that I'm sure we're aware of, but do we understand why it works? So if you read the book by Diane Boston and Bud Allen, it highlights basically an inmate who's making these requests that progressively get bigger and bigger and bigger until the officer goes from giving a pen, which is somewhat ambiguous, to finally giving a uniform. Now remember, the reason why this method works is because the inmate's initial request is consistent with their subsequent request. Okay, it's consistent, and we have a habit of being consistent. It's in our nature to be consistent. It's kind of like the foot in the door, if you will. Once your foot's in the door, you continue on that path. Snowball effect, unfortunately, here, because it's getting progressively worse. So again, inmate may ask for something rather small, like a pen, even though we know we shouldn't give it. We have experience, but some may just be like, well, I don't know, you know, should I give the inmate the pen? They wind up giving the inmate the pen, and eventually each thing that they're given, they're small, become leverage for the ultimate request at the end, which, had that been asked for first, the officer, hopefully, or the staff member would have said, hell no, I'm not giving that to you. What are you crazy? I'm not giving a uniform. But again, it's progressive leverage, and it's based on minimal compliance, because they're requests that are rather small that tend to get greater as they move up. So again, there's a couple of reasons why that works, and I want to mention it because it deals with human behavior. Okay, so one thing is this: as I mentioned, if you have staff that has found their support amongst the inmate population, now, however they got there, you know, again, I told you, you know, it could be many ways, but the inmates need to isolate staff from support staff. That's their key to manipulation, because they want to make sure that when the officer or staff is lost, they don't know what to do, that they don't go to support staff. So they could do that a couple of ways. They could build animosity between staff. The staff member could not be near support staff. That's why I told you the importance of, you know, frequenting those areas a lot more. But either way, the key to this game is that support staff has to be isolated from the victim, which will be the staff member that they're choosing to manipulate. Okay, so now once that happens and a staff member gets caught in a situation that's rather ambiguous to them, they're going to look to their environment to help define their situation. And in this case here, the environment, their support, is inmates. That's how the game will eventually begin. Okay, because the person has somehow, again, I don't know how it's happened, has somehow put more trust in the inmate population instead of support staff. And again, you know, there's many ways that can happen. I've talked about that in other videos. Okay, so So the initial request is rather small, subtle, whatever it is, something small, pen. Let's just say it's a pen. Now, again, we know not to give that, but whatever the case may be, it's enough to kind of make someone think, should I give it to him? I shouldn't. I should always say no. But in this case here, he just got to sign something. It's not that big of a deal. Whatever it is, it's a small request that keeps the person on the fence, where the answer really isn't a definitive no. It's kind of some type of discretion to it. And unfortunately, this person sides with giving the inmate the pen, which will eventually become leverage later on as the game progresses, if you will. So now, the inmate will continue to ask for other things. Small thing like a pen may become a candy bar, whatever it is. But they keep on using the leverage from the prior request. Okay, so basically, eventually when you get too far and there's no turning back and you go to say no, the inmate's going to come back up with everything else you've given them already. And say, well, if you gave me these things already, you better give me this. Because if not, I'm going to turn you in. But the question is, how do we get to those steps? How does the inmate have 5 or 6 things that they shouldn't have? That's the problem. Why did I not know enough to turn back? Yeah, maybe I made a mistake and I gave him the first thing that I shouldn't have given him. But how did I get to 6 things that the person shouldn't have? How did it get that far? And I mentioned one thing was consistency. But second thing is that I've learned, this is the scary part, guys, and you got to pay attention to this, please. At one point, my beliefs may sort of have been against my behavior. When I was initially asked for something, it was rather ambiguous, and I wind up giving the person something that maybe they shouldn't have, but again, rather ambiguous, wasn't the end of the world, like the pen I mentioned. And then what happened here is eventually I have to start justifying that action because it went against my beliefs. It's what they call cognitive dissonance. Okay? I felt uncomfortable giving it to them, but I have given it to them. So in my head, I start to justify that action. Well, I had to give him a pen. He had to write something. He didn't have a pen. He told me he had to write a letter to his family. I had to give him the pen. So now it's become justified as to why I've given him the pen. And then when they ask for the next request, it becomes that much more simpler for me to give him an item or her an item because I've already justified the request prior. I already justified what I've done before. And remember, the next request is just a small step forward. That means if there was a problem with that subsequent request, the second request, then there should have been a problem with the first request. But I've already justified the first request. That means it's a lot easier now for me to justify the second request. Eventually the third request. The fourth request. Remember, in my mind, as the victim, I'm not looking at step 1 to step 5. I'm looking at step 4 to step 5. Small little steps. I'm looking at the small steps, not the leap, if you will. So from the small steps, it doesn't look that bad. But then finally, when the inmate makes it to the end, and you actually realize, like, what have I done? I'm not going to give an inmate a uniform. How did I even get this far? Then you start looking at where you've been. Now you look at the final step, and you compare it to the first. And you're like, oh my God, did I take a serious leap? So again, I have learned at this point to justify my behavior. Where at the beginning, maybe it was questionable. My belief was kind of like, this doesn't seem right. But eventually, because I've committed to the first step, again, there's a commitment there as well. That's another aspect of it all. We've committed to the first step already. And it's consistent to the inmate's initial request as this, as he progresses in his request. I start to justify that. Now, for officers, that's where our support matters. Because the officer that's a victim is not going to realize that they're being played. They're not going to see that. That's why it's good for us to police each other. Because we will have a different perspective. And just a little interaction at the very beginning with that officer can wake them up to the covert game that's being played. Little interaction like, my man, hey, don't give him that. Don't give him that. But the problem is if we wait too long, there's a danger here. Because now the officer may learn to have already justified that behavior, and then when you go to challenge him and say, or her, and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, that officer may now, that may enforce the officer to continue that relationship because he's already justified that behavior. And now when you go to correct him or her, they believe they're right. So by you telling them that they're wrong may only reinforce what they're doing because they've already justified the behavior. So in closing, for those officers, and I know it's complicated here too, because it's hard for an officer to see it happen and then step up and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, because they're so afraid that the one telling the officer, hey, what you're doing is wrong, may be wrong themselves. And they're so concerned about social acceptability, if you will. You know what I mean? What about if I tell him and I'm wrong? What about if I tell her and I'm wrong? You know, but you got to realize, you being wrong, what's the consequence of that? A misunderstanding among officers who should understand why and that you were out to protect them? Or that you were right and you didn't say nothing? The fact that you were right and you didn't say nothing. Something happens in that facility and you knew that something was happening, that your partner was being played. You have a role to play, and that role is to stop that from happening, getting involved. So for anybody that says, I think I knew, or I thought that was happening, well, do something. Do something. And for those that say, I knew it was happening, you should have done something. There's no excuse. No excuse. The games criminals play was just a uniform. What about if it was a weapon? What about if an officer was killed or a staff member was killed? Would you jump up and say, I knew something was wrong? That's the question. Again, it's minimum compliance. Explains why downing a duck works. Love you guys. Stay safe. I thought I'd give you a little manipulation 101, if you will. Love you guys. Stay safe.